All right. Well, hey, howdy, everyone. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. Um, Chris is on a plane. I am pushing buttons all over the place. I don't know if I'm pushing the right ones. Who knows? But we're here. And it's actually, it's good that, mistakes happen because we're human. And today's episode is behind the scenes of the Marketing Over Coffee podcast. And so John is the owner and host of Marketing Over Coffee. You and Chris have been doing this podcast for the past, I think, 15, 16.
640 years. I did 18, I think, is where
Wow.
it'll be like 19 in March or something like that.
And so I'm sure, like you've refined your processes over the years, but I'm sure one of the questions either you get asked or you're often thinking about is, where does AI fit in? How much of this can I automate with AI? Or is that a question you even consider?
Yeah, I've never had that. We do hear some people talk about like, well, where does AI fit into podcasting? But I think it's kind of still been too early for that. We're seeing some stuff on image generation. We're seeing some stuff on audio, on music. That's not too bad. So it's coming. It's getting closer. But yeah, the closest thing would be using AI to make clips of stuff that already exists, but nothing at the production end. It's all pretty much post-production kind of stuff.
So you don't feel like, so I know that there's like AI editors out there that will like edit the audio and video and take out stop words, take out pauses. You don't use anything like that at the moment.
Yeah, the problem with all that stuff for me is it's all the same, is that none of it's perfect, like stop words and things like that. Yeah, you can go through and you can grab 80% of just the ums and clip them out, and that works. But as you get into more complicated interviews, like actually for another project I was doing a couple months ago about school shootings, people were talking about what had happened, and there's pauses in there and people getting choked up. And that's the kind of stuff that you don't want to delete. Like that's getting the story across in a more effective manner. And so, yeah, the end result is I always listen to the whole thing before it goes out the door. So I might as well be doing the clipping and editing myself. I mean, I have in the past used other production services to, do some of the cleanup, and then I listen to it. And so, yeah, it takes away, 60% of the cleanup work, but it's still an hour, it's an hour to go through the show versus an hour 15. And I can take a link out of the chain if I just do it myself. So yeah, it's, well, and we can talk about this more too, if you want to dig down into it, but there is a whole thing of, there's kind of just putting content out there and having it be available, and more on an academic level of it's like, it's on the record and people can go get to it when they want to have questions answered or researching specific topics. But if you're building a show and building a story, that's kind of more dramatic and requires a lot more massaging, and you're working with beats, and there's a lot of things that go into how that final product sounds. And so that's kind of a different thing. Tom Webster has written a lot about that in his latest book about how, it's creating a podcast or creating content is one thing, but doing a show is something a little bit different.
So I know that you go through a pre-production process before every episode. Can you walk us through a little bit of what that looks like and how you get yourself ready? If you have guests, one of the things that we also want to sort of touch upon before we actually do the live recording of Marketing Over Coffee, so people can actually see what that looks like. How do you keep an interview engaging? Like, I'm sure over the course of 18 years, you've had some people on your show that have kind of dragged a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about your pre-production process, and also how do you sort of keep the energy up if you're, if the person you're interviewing is kind of either giving you like one word answers or just not engaged at all?
Yeah, that's one thing that's, for Marketing Over Coffee, it's not as much of a challenge as it is for other types of things, right? I mean, the majority of people that I'm talking to are in the marketing field, and they're probably responsible for selling or convincing people of stuff. So, yeah, if you're able to land a CMO job, I'm not worried about, you not filling 20 minutes to talk about your thing. In fact, it's usually the opposite. It's having to rein people in and get them to where they want to go. But another one is, yeah, that's one of the great things about, the day and age we're living in here today, Whereas pretty much any pitch that I get, I can usually go up to YouTube or LinkedIn or somewhere and watch some video of them, of what they're doing, and I can hear how they sound and what they're talking about and if they have their act together or not. So that's great. And so you hit it with pre-production, right? There's a ton of work that goes on behind the scenes. Even just the fact of like I was going through a whole cycle this past week of one of the publishers that we've had a lot of authors on before. They send me their pre-releases. I get this list of like, okay, here's all the books coming out from January to June from us in 2025. So I can go through and look at the authors and see who's who and if they're people that we'd be interested in talking to or not, and filtering them. And so it's not too difficult when I have them on camera, because up at that point there's been enough filtering and understanding of what they're going to be talking about that we can keep them on the beat. But that doesn't change the fact that I've got the full show notes. In fact, this is like the first of the behind the scene things that would give people a look of what this thing actually looks like, so that they get an idea for what's happening. So this is the basic show note template that we use. In fact, this was I was talking to the CMO of Zappy, this company in Boston. Natalie Kelly is there, and these were the show notes that we had put together for this. And leading off, you give them the link to the StreamYard so that when they're ready to talk, they can get in there. For a lot of CMOs, I'm talking with probably a PR agency or their own PR person, and sharing this up ahead of time gives them the opportunity to give us all the links to the books or social or LinkedIn or whatever they've got. And then from the story side, there's the big idea. There's always one big, what is the takeaway from this episode? Like, what are we trying to get out there? Then we get their approved bio. I start to get some points, that I want to hit. I highlight and dig into. We make sure we have their headshot already approved and locked in before the show goes. And then it's all about the rundown, right? That's the real, the meat of the prep. Is if they've read a book, I've got all my book notes in here. If they're talking about products or whatever, that's all in here. And the show has a real structure, a 3-act process to it. So, the shows run about anywhere from 24 to 30 minutes. The first act is setting up the subject, the character, who they are, what they do, what was their history that got them to where they are today. And then we have a 60-second sponsor spot. The second act is where we do all the heavy lifting, right? That's where we've introduced some concepts in the first act, and now we get right all the way down to tactics of how this stuff works and where it fits into what they've got going on. That usually gets us to like the 16 to 20 minute mark. There's a second 60-second spot there for one of the sponsors. And then, we try to wind down in the last act. I mean, we'll wrap up anything that we got into that was prickly in the second act. But the third act is, talking to them a little more as a person, thinking about what they're looking at in the future. We usually always let them recommend a book or movie or music or, something that gets them a little bit more human out the door, and then share links, where to go. Like for Natalie here, she's got a book coming out in the fall through Kogan Page. So we were talking about that. And then a basic FAQ, for the PR folks as far as what goes on, and some sample copy for when we're going to promote it. But so, having that doc out there really gives everybody an idea of what topics are going to be hit and when. Like, there's no surprises for the guest. They're able to prepare and give us notes. And even a lot of times, once in a while, the PR people will say, hey, this is a topic we can't go near because this is something that, whatever, there's litigation, or they don't like to talk about it, or whatever the deal is, or we can't, divulge. That's a big one with publicly traded companies. A lot of times I'll be able to put things together. I'll be like, oh, okay, so it looks like you're going here. And they're like, yeah, no, we can't talk about that. But that gets everybody on the right map.
Nice. And I know, having done a couple of episodes with you, like, you always, when you're not interviewing people for Marketing Over Coffee, whether it's you and Chris or me filling in for Chris, you sort of switch contexts, and you still have that 3-act structure, but it's more about, here's what's happening in marketing, or here's what's happening sort of in the industry news. Let's talk about those, get those opinions. So I like how you have that balance with your show, where it's not only just, I'm interviewing the person who just wrote a book, but it's also helping your audience keep track of, here's what's actually happening in the industry that you need to pay attention to. Would you say it's sort of like a 50-50 balance of interviews and non-interviews in terms of your episodes, or do you feel like you skew one way or the other?
No, it tends to be about 50-50. Yeah, that's kind of the idea. I mean, the big part is when I do the regular segments, with like Chris and where you fill in. that the beats are, the first segment is always the shiny object. It's kind of the biggest news, whatever's hot. And then second segment is more in-depth analysis. So what, if there's topics there that are interesting but need more explanation and need to dig in. And then the third, again, we try and get to be a little more fun and engaging out the door. So that's Gear Watches over there, and we talk about music or other stuff that's not directly marketing related, but maybe are memes or things that people do need to be aware of. It's not the serious business stuff. So and there's a lot of people far smarter than me in this kind of stuff have done a lot of research as far as by keeping in those kind of like 3 8-minute segments, you're not burning, you're not reaching cognitive overload. Like people are not getting bored or starting to lose the thread or understand it. And, it's just enough to keep them engaged. And the real goal is for them to, when they close out at the 25 minutes or whatever, say, God, that went quick. You never want anybody that's like, okay, when is it going to end? You want them to be looking forward to the next one, because at no point did it slow down.
Do you feel like there's, I know there's a lot of podcasts that will go on for like an hour, 90 minutes. Like, what is it about the sort of 20 to 25-minute mark that you think works really well for a podcast?
Yeah, that's, from the academic side, we kind of know that people can go from like 45 to an hour or so, and they may fade in and out of there. But if it's something that they want to learn about, they're gonna stick in with that. Once you get beyond an hour, then it starts to get weird, because then it's kind of like a lot of times people are breaking into chunks. They'll listen to for 30 minutes and another 30 and go. And the thought always for us has just been, there's so many other podcasts out there. There's so much stuff. If you're always in that, quick bite that people can fit in anywhere, they will fit it in anywhere. And when time comes for them to start throwing some podcasts off the list, well, that one that's 3 hours a week, like that's an easy call if it's not entertaining them.
So we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the gear. And, when I started working with you, I learned a lot about having the proper gear. And now I feel like with the resurgence of podcasts, around the time of 2020, when people couldn't leave their homes, like, oh, what do I do? I know, I'll start a podcast. Gear became much more readily available, if that makes sense. So it's not that the microphones and the audio didn't exist before, but the makers of those things, I think, saw a market that was, new to podcasting. And so I feel like they made discount versions or things like packages like podcast starter kits. So what are the basic things that if I were to start a podcast tomorrow, what are the, half a dozen things I should have gear wise?
Yeah, and you hit the point with that, is that the gear has been changing and morphing the entire time that we've been doing this. And lockdown was huge. Not only, podcasting did surge and there was a great increase, but the whole transfer to Zoom culture, worked for everybody. People started to realize that, okay, I need a decent camera. I need, the ability to share my screen. I need to learn how to use screen sharing software. So that completely accelerated everything, because when we had started out, it was far easier to sit together in person in the same room and record and then use the audio editing tools. And it's gone to the complete other end of the spectrum now, where it's easier for us to do virtual than it is to try and get together in a space. You can just get the same kind of sound. So there's, and as we had promised with the rundown for the show, there's two basic sides to it, right? It's software and hardware. And so for the software stack, actually, let's see if I get trapped in a loop here. I think we can do this though. Like, this has worked in the past. I should be able to show, well, maybe not. We'll see if it freaks out. Here we go. Okay, you're getting the infinite window. But this is the best tool right here, is StreamYard, right? Because you can see we have this working tool of, we got 3 cameras, we've got background, all this stuff is there and working. And it is a little bit freaky. I'm going to get that out of there. But StreamYard is the best tool for us. And there are other tools that do this kind of online meeting thing. But the biggest thing that has worked here is that they have the best caching and content network for video. There's a couple other services, like I do have to give a shout out for some of the other, I'm trying to remember off the top of the head. Like, we used to use Zencastr. We used to use the guys out of the West Coast. Oh, they're going to kill me because I can't remember the name off the top of my head. It's been so long. We've been on StreamYard for over a year. Like there's other ones that do a little bit better job with the audio, actually. And there's other
Mhm.
ones that do a better job of if you want to have like 6 or 8 people in the room. But the thing for us, it just came down to video lag. It's like all those features are cool, but if your video lags at some point, that kills the whole thing. And StreamYard has proved itself to be the best at not lagging on video. So yeah, that's the first chunk of the software here is that, we get in on this. We're able to kind of do the whole video production thing. And then, beyond podcasting too, if you want to be streaming on LinkedIn and Twitter and Twitch, it can do all those things at the same time. So you kind of kill a bunch of birds with one stone there as far as getting the audio recording. And so, yeah, I pull the audio recording from here. And then the other, big software tool for me is I'm on the full Adobe suite. So once I jump from there, it goes over to Audition. Let's see, of the 67,000 windows, this is the normal window that I have running for that. It's, for anybody that's worked with a nonlinear editor, you kind of just look at this and you totally get what's going on. I have myself on track 1, the guest is on track 2. Here I'm playing around on tracks 4 and 5 with other recordings. It's kind of neat in that, I've got StreamYard recording myself, but I also have a hardware device here, and I'm going to show that off. We'll talk about that too. But so I can get in there and have a local recording besides the recording that's up there. And so, yeah, Audition is the tool of choice for me just because we use Audition. And then when it comes to editing the blog post, I use Dreamweaver. When I'm doing the show images, I'm using Photoshop, and that's all Adobe. And so you pay one price and you get all that stuff. So that, works well for us. Also in the stack for that. Okay. Yes. So first tip I was going to throw out there is plugins. For Audition, I use SoundSoap. That's the secret weapon for the show, is that it does 2 different things. It has the ability to, if you have a guest that has fan or air conditioner or washing machine or whatever, some kind of weird background noise, it can pull that out. I mean, you can do that in Audition, but it's kind of challenging. With SoundSoap, you just click one button, you're like, okay, kill the noise, and it does kill the noise. So yeah, I guess that's funny, and I hadn't thought about it. That is an AI tool that has been using this long before the AI craze, because there's insane stories about that piece of software actually disappeared for a couple of years because the founders got in some kind of litigation, and word never got out as to what exactly happened, but it sort of disappeared for like a year and a half, and it's back to normal now. But besides the killing the noise, it also just has a sparkle button, that you click on, and it just makes your voice a little bit more radio, a little bit more impactful, and a little bit I call it shiny, and then they call it shiny because it's what it does. So yeah, it's $99 to plug it in and make that work. And that can, especially if you get in a situation where, your guest for some reason was next to the railroad tracks or some insanity, you can salvage audio and get some stuff back that was horrible. So that's oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and I want to ask a little bit more about the audio, because I know you're talking about software, but the hardware for audio is just as important. And I'm sort of personally blown away by the amount of people who still use their computer speakers or just use their headphone speakers for recording audio, and it always sounds kind of tinny. Now, I know this is going to be getting a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's an important thing to note, especially depending on how you're recording your podcast. So there's a lot of different kinds of microphones. There's a lot of things that pick up audio. So one of the trends that I see is, as everybody's starting their own podcast, you have the hosts. There's a video recording the hosts sitting around like in the same room, holding the microphones in front of their face. And my first thought is, well, they certainly don't know enough about microphones to pick the right ones. So somebody on the production team picked, those, the microphones that only pick up sound from a single direction, and they have them set up in a certain way. So can you speak to us a little bit about the microphone choice, for example? So, you can see my microphone on the screen. I speak into it from the side. I can't have this microphone like the top over here facing me, because it won't actually pick up the sound. And I feel like that's a mistake that a lot of novice podcasters or content creators do is they pick the wrong mic, and or they don't know how to set it up correctly, or they're relying on their iPods, which for regular meetings is fine, but for audio production is really, there's no excuse for it.
Yeah, no, you brought us some fantastic points there. In fact, so that's a huge one, is what you talked about, is that side address, right? That's what you have is called the side address. You talk into the side of the microphone. Everybody thinks you, on all microphones, you talk into the top, and that's not the case. And yeah, there's really nothing that hits me better than when I get a pitch from somebody telling me about their awesome podcast, and I see them with a picture talking into the top of a side address microphone. You're like, yeah, no, dude, you don't know what you're doing. You're lying. And that does happen all the time. And on the other side of the coin with that, it is amazing the shine you'll see in your eyes when you tell them, no, why don't you talk towards the logo there on the side, and they hear the sound and they're like, oh my God, this microphone really is great. And, they finally get there. So yeah, well, actually, so this is the other, I was glad that we were doing this, because this is a skill set that I, used to use all the time, and I rarely use anymore. But so here's the whole rig behind the scenes. And as you can see, this is the, I have to get all the names and models. So I use the Shure MV7, which is Shure's radio mic, but it's USB. It's actually made for computing. The other Shure microphone that's hugely popular is the SM7B. And that's like a $400 mic, and it only has the big XLR wire connector.
Yeah, mine has an XLR. If you can see my screen, I have this big blue. I have a Marantz.
You're on Marantz? Yeah, that's
old.
I
have a Marantz.
It's
less expensive than a Shure.
Yeah, no, that is a fantastic mic. Marantz gear is like, from the 60s and 50s, even has a huge, rich tradition.
I love this legit behind the scenes look of what's going on.
I know what's really happening. And so
I love this.
This is the big magic right here, is the Rode Procaster. I always get it wrong. It's not the Rode Procaster. It's the Rodecaster Pro 2. And so this box is like $700. It's not inexpensive. But the thing is, this is just insane, because I have, you've got the XLR in, so you can have up to 4 microphones plugged into this thing. And you've got the super cool sliders that you can play with. Everybody loves to do that. And you've got the soundboard too. So if you want to fire music and tunes, the marketing over coffee intro can drop, and I can serve that, back down the line. But yeah, this thing is huge. And then as far as other power that this provides, the big thing is that when you've got when you're driving the microphone, this box is able to do compression and expansion. So the idea is, even if I have to move around a little bit and away from the mic, if my microphone technique is not dead on, this will actually amplify or clamp down on the sound to keep it at a consistent level. So that's a huge win, because that's the kind of stuff that a lot of people do in Here I am also, by the way, the Incredible Hulk Owala water bottle, very popular with this.
Hydration is key, kids. Drink your water.
It is. And the side holster, we'll have a link to that in the show notes, so folks can grab one of those as they go. But yeah, compression expansion is big. And the other huge one is this has a noise gate. And in fact, you can actually see this, like while I'm talking there on channel 1, right? You see the bar, but when I stop, that'll go to dead zero, like a car just went by. It's programmed so that when my voice comes on, it's at a certain level, so it's letting that signal go through. But when I'm not talking and it falls below a certain level, it just says, okay, drop that all the way to zero, then actually kill that channel. So if there is washing machine, air conditioner, fan, whatever, something running, you set that noise gate so that annoying sound is below the noise gate's level. And so then when you're not talking, it just turns that off and you have dead silence on the channel. And so that, again, that's another thing that makes post-production easier and cleanup easier.
I would assume that there's also, and I can see that I'm on channel 2, which is actually kind of cool, but you would imagine you need to have, your different audio files on different channels. I would imagine there's also like a quick kill button, or, we call it a kill button, but it's a quick mute button. So like if something happens, and rather than like fumbling around on your screen to try to figure out how to mute, like, is there a button on that soundboard where you can just like press it and it mutes your mic immediately?
Yeah, right. So that's the thing. So I have on my channel 1 that red light, right? When that goes, I'm gone. And so I can, and you totally nailed that. See, that's a great stealth move for, excuse me, for Zoom meetings and for Hangouts. I can mute myself from here, but on the meeting software, it still looks like the microphone's on. So nobody knows if I'm muting or hiding myself, or lurking. I can control the audio from over here. And so that's much better. It also has the green button is interesting. That's a solo button. So if something weird's going on, like you're getting some kind of weird buzz, you can go down the channels and say, okay, let me solo those. So when you hit that button, you're only hearing that and not the other channels. And so if you have a weird buzz, you can just go down and say, oh, okay, this is where the buzz is. You can figure out who's got the problem. Or echo too. If you're getting some weird echo, you can run down and do solos and see which one has it. Well, of course, the first easy move is mute the channels, run through and mute them all and figure out who's who. But yeah, so this box is pretty good. And then of course it's fully onboard recording, right? I have a hot light there. And that's a whole nother thing too. Like when I'm in Zoom meetings, I don't have to have an extra attendee that tips off that we're recording. Like I just hit the record button over here and grab the files off of there when I'm done. And so that makes it much easier to, know if I'm recording or not, because, God forbid you have one of those automated plugins and it doesn't fire and you don't have a recording, like you're completely burned from that. One interesting thing too, this box is pretty old. It's about 3 or 4 years in now. They do make the Duo, which is only 2 channels. And so it's significantly smaller box too. And that's only $500. If I was really enterprising, I'd sell this on eBay and, go get the $500 one, but I just can't be, like all production people, I'm like, okay, it works. Do not breathe on it. Don't even look at it. Like, just let it do it.
Don't jiggle the wires. My God.
Exactly. Don't let anything go.
Yeah.
So yeah. And so another one too, I was going to show off is this mic arm. Like this is kind of cool in that this folds back and goes off the desk. So when I'm not recording, it's out of my way. So that was a big one. The other one, just for a second too, but not to make people sick, but the PlexiCam is an interesting thing. That's it's a plastic arm that I got to find a way to pause this or like not make it so annoying when I'm just talking about random stuff. It's in lieu of a teleprompter, right? I'm able to have that up there and talk straight into the camera, but still see stuff on my screen. So I have my prompts and the show notes and stuff, so I don't lose my way, but it doesn't look like I'm looking at the stuff down on my desk or whatever.
But also your keyboard, my God.
Oh yeah, we're going through the whole, this was all part of the thing too. We'll go to this next. So this is the workstation, right? The idea is if you're going to be spending hours and hours doing this kind of stuff, you have to have a full-on workstation. So this desk stand is, it's lower than my regular desk, right? So it's the correct wrist height. And yeah, the keyboard. So this is the Keyboardio Atrius, which is, uber geek keyboard. But the idea is, so it's a broken keyboard, they call this. It's twisted at the side. So I don't have to force my wrist, right? My natural hand position is actually straight on in this. And
I was just doing that over my keyboard. I was like, oh
right,
yeah.
It's so crazy. You'll feel that too. You're just like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, like I feel that carpal tunnel syndrome totally, get to me as I'm there. So the broken keyboard is one thing. But then, of course, this thing goes uber nerd in that this is the Dvorak layout. It's not the standard, they call it QWERTY, which is the top word, right? But this is Dvorak. So I have all the main vowels right on the center row, big hand, and all the hottest consonants on the other side.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I would not recommend doing this. That's the ultimate.
Did you have to teach yourself how to retype?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this was in like, when did I do that? Like 2005 or something like that, like a long time ago. I decided, because I had read all this stuff about like the world record typists that do like 140 words a minute use this layout. This is the way they go. And there is actually the crazy story behind that is that the QWERTY layout is actually designed to be the slowest possible layout, because on typewriters, they don't want the arms that hit the page to jam. And so they made it the worst possible layout that they could to slow type this down so the typewriters wouldn't jam. And of course, we don't have any of that problem right now, but like we want top speed. So this is the optimized layout. But I got, I'm like 10 words faster. I used to be at like 80. I'm at like 90 now or something like that. So it is a little bit faster. And I do have to say, I don't feel it in my fingers the same way. Like it's less headache. But now the problem is when I go sit down at a regular keyboard somewhere else, it's not the same.
Right.
And then this is either a benefit or a feature, depending on how you look at it. But no one else in the house can use my computer either. Like they sit down and they can't figure out what the heck's going on. And and I, at least because this is hardware, it is the right layout. But for a lot of times, for years, I just had a regular keyboard. So the keys weren't actually what they said. Like I wasn't looking at it, so I didn't need it anyways. But you
Right.
literally couldn't type at all. Um,
No. That
the
looks like a nightmare to me.
yeah, that is hell. But one thing about this style keyboard, this micro keyboard that is fantastic is I have this any key here, and that actually activates the second layer. So all of these keys have a second key underneath them.
Oh my
Uh,
god.
so like actually this square right here of 9, that's actually 1 to 9. So when I do numbers, I don't have to move up to the number row. I just hold down the any key and I can key the numbers I want. And
Oh
the
my god.
4-directional cursor and a bunch of the other top row number stuff, that's over on this side. So I can actually cursor around and all this stuff without ever moving my hands. That's the ultimate goal is you're
Right.
taking all the hand movement out of it. And so it just makes you faster all the way across the board.
I
Um,
didn't know what I was signing up for today when we said we're going to do behind the scenes like that. Like I have just this regular
just a
Bluetooth
regular keyboard, yeah.
quiet keyboard. Now, interesting, similar to you, I have this mic arm that I can swing out of the way that's always at the right height, and I just swing it out of the way when I'm not using it. And similar to you, I also have not attached to my desk, but I have this little, I don't know what you call it, like a lap desk that I put my keyboard and it has like the fold out for the mouse so that it's at the right height versus at my desk. So very similar to you, I have those things because I do enough, it's we're sort of going beyond podcasting, but sort of just the gear in general. If you're going to be producing a lot of content, you want to make sure that you're doing things in such a way that it's not harmful to your body. It's ergonomically more structurally sound because you're sitting at a computer for a long time. Now, I do want to ask you, because like one of the things that I know was going around in, I don't know if it was our community or someone else's community, was the idea of using Notebook LM to basically, actually, I think it was in our community, so I can pull up the conversation. Um, Using Notebook LM to do podcast summaries, and basically cloning somebody's voice and have it, basically you don't even have to be there. You don't even have to be involved. You just have to give enough samples of your voice and somebody can have your voice sort of say anything and it cuts down on the production. So as someone who professionally produces podcasts, what do you think about that? Like, is that something you would consider? Is that going to sort of change the way you do it? Is it going to be the end of marketing over coffee as we know it because AI is going to do it and John Wall is going to be sitting on a beach while synthetic John Wall is doing marketing over coffee? Like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, I mean, I always view it as black swan stuff. So, but there is this interesting idea of, if you had the script, you could then put it in your voice without actually having to record it. Like that's totally possible. But the thing is, it's a lot more work to sit down and write a script than it is to just sit and record the audio and do the podcast yourself. One thing that is really cool with that, that it's not in my workflow yet, but I could totally see it becoming part of the workflow, is I do have problems a lot of times with, a lot of the folks we talk to are doing really interesting stuff, but they're not professional speakers. Like they're not recording audiobooks,
Right.
And there's a lot of times where I'll get somebody that is just using like too many times. And there's sometimes they're using that I have to leave it in because I can't clean it up. Like another word runs into the like. And if I trim the like out, it'll be obvious that I've made an edit, which is an absolute, no way. And so some of the latest tools now do have the ability where it'll give you the transcript and you can actually rewrite it to make it more accurate or cleaner. And it will then put it back in their voice. And so that's kind of cool. I mean, it is, right? Theoretically, you're messing with their brand and their voice. But of course, for everything I'd be doing it for, it would be making them sound better and, cleaning up flubs and things like that. Because sometimes too, people get excited and they start running. And it's like when you run a transcript of that, it doesn't even make sense. Like when you're listening, it makes more sense. But yeah, the ability to do clean up on the fly, I don't see any easy way to do, you see it used for weather reports, newscasts, sports reporting, all that stuff. You can just have a printout of what's going on, put it in a voice and make a podcast out of it. But the stuff we do is kind of exploring ideas and more dynamic. It actually not going to save you much time in the long run.
Well, and I like that you brought that up because I was going to ask are there specific use cases? So as the conversation was happening in the Slack group, which if you want to participate, it's trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. It's our free Slack community. You can join, you don't have to pay anything, totally free. The conversation was around someone saying that the CEO that they work with is great with the written word, but they refuse to do audio and video content. So I can see the use case of using something like a Notebook LM and the AI synthetic, voice of the person to create the audio content if that person isn't comfortable doing that. But I think you're absolutely right. In the use case where it's more of an interview and, you can have the questions written ahead of time, but writing the answers ahead of time and then recording it, like you could just do the AI version. But I feel like even today, like you and I, we knew we were going to go in doing behind the scenes stuff. I knew the kind of questions that I was going to ask. But I feel like this particular episode has taken a lot of interesting twists and turns that we wouldn't have gotten had we just stuck to, okay, here's the script, here's the questions, here's the answers. AI can do it. Like, I feel like you're going to lose some of that humanness, some of that, like I like the tangents. I like when people sort of go off a little bit because that's where you can see like the critical thinking is happening, the ideas are happening, and you don't want to lose that. And so I'm glad we brought up that aspect of it because I can see a lot of people are going to be like, well, I can just use AI to build a podcast. I don't even need to be there. But everything has to be so planned out. And you definitely, definitely, definitely don't want to leave it to AI to just make it up.
Yeah, right. You could get hallucination city going crazy. But yeah, you hit the key point there is that it actually generates more empathy because you don't realize what's coming next. So you are actively surprised by some of the things you see, or it takes you in a new direction. And that's the same thing that happens to the listener, right? Because they're not expecting what's coming to them. And it's all new to them as they're hearing it the first time. So now the host and the listener are, they're paired and identified and they're in the same role, which gives them a common experience. And that helps get the message across and makes it it's more of an experience. You're not just studying or learning, you're actually kind of going through an adventure.
Have you ever had, and you don't have to name names unless you really want to, have you ever had a guest on your show that when the interview was done in your mind, you're like, this is awful, I don't want to even put this out? Like, have you ever just been like, oops, everything got deleted, I don't know how that happened, I guess we can't publish your episode? Like, have you ever had someone, because I know we talk about how to keep the interview engaging, and you mentioned like a lot of the people are people who are used to talking, used to giving information, but have you ever had, your very special episode of Marketing Over Coffee that you just were not proud of?
Yeah, I fall back always to Seth Godin's statement on that, is that, half your work is below average. That's just the way the world works. And so, yeah, there's plenty of shows where I'm like, oh, I wish, something more interesting happened that week, or I wish this person knew what the heck was going on. Like you said, I can't name names, but the worst one is we see this sometimes. It has happened more than once where, an executive has, quote, written a book. And then when you're interviewing, it's obvious that they did not write this, somebody in the PR team or did it, or they ghosted it or whatever. And that can even be okay. That can be salvaged if they can talk intelligently about it. But the worst thing is if, I'm like, well, you talk about the 7 points for X, and they're like, well, actually, we've changed this. It's the 5 points of Y, and it's like, yeah, no, it's not, buddy. You didn't write the book. Like, I get that. So yeah, those are the worst ones. But yeah, I am in kind of an because it's weird how we're part of the community. And so all of the guests are also in the audience. And so, yeah, I really can't get myself into a position where I've not had a situation where we've recorded something and then I've said, oh, that's so horrible, like we have to throw that in the trash. You have to vanish. And that's a practicality too. Like, I just don't have the time to throw to. And that was an eye opener for me, though, as far as like what happens on the bigger shows. Okay, so like NPR, a big show like This American Life, they'll go out and start building 12 shows and recording. and maybe 4 or 5 of them make it to see light of day on the radio. There's a huge pile of shows where they work for, God, some of them, they'll even work for months or years. And they'll just be like, yeah, this just never goes anywhere. It doesn't resolve, or it's just not that interesting.
Hmm.
And it ends up in the trash can. And that's another thing that Tom Webster will get into too, of like, you can't have this mindset of like, whatever we record, we'll just throw it out there. Like, you have to have a through line to it, and it's got to go somewhere. Because listeners are not just going to listen to something because it was 7 a.m. and you had to publish it. It's like you've got to have more of a plan than that.
I saw that post on Threads. It's 7 a.m. Doesn't matter what the quality. It's got to go out anyway. And I also saw Tom respond to it not so nicely, which I totally understand. Like, there's something to be said for consistency, but you also need to have the quality to go with that.
Yeah, it's an interesting area because, for some people, there's people who are like, if they don't have a deadline, they just never do anything. And so for those people, it's like, okay, make sure you write something by 7 a.m. But, and Tom's huge thing is that doesn't mean you have to share it to the world. Like, have your deadline of having it done by 7 a.m. every day. But then the next day, go listen to it and say, hey, is this willing to, be shared? Is it worth doing?
So last question for you, or I mean, I never run out of questions for you, but like, last question for today's live stream. How do you avoid, so, we're talking about, podcasts in the marketing industry. There's a lot of podcasts in the marketing industry. How do you avoid the sameness? Like, so if, I'll just use myself as an example. If I'm a guest on your show, and then I'm a guest on someone else's show, and then I'm a guest on someone else's show, and I've just written a book, there's going to be a lot of overlap of the questions. Like, oh, so you just wrote a book. Tell me what it's about. How do you break through that sameness? I know. And I feel like that's a really big question, but like, for people who are like, yeah, that's a problem I have. So walk us through a little bit of behind the scenes of your thinking, you, John Wall, the host of Marketing Over Coffee, how to break out of some of that sameness.
Yeah, well, you hit a great point in that you do have to have an angle. I mean, there's some, it usually ties to your audience, of course, like that's part of it, right? Like, even though the author is doing these 10 podcasts, he's talking to 10 different groups of people. So they're kind of okay with that. But yeah, they definitely get into a groove of like, okay, here's the first 5 questions that I normally get answered. And you can totally see that they're on autopilot. They've got their tropes all lined up and they're hitting it. And I don't know, that is one thing that has always been the philosophy of the show that I've always stuck with. I always say, we start at the last page of the book, that, when the author shows up, we've read the whole book and we know what all the key points are and can talk intelligently about them. And the thing that people miss is that, for a lot of these authors, like, that book's been done for a year. They've been out speaking about it and they've progressed beyond even what they've written, and they're into the new stuff. So yeah, that's one thing where I always get guests that love to come on the show and are excited about it because they get to talk about what's happened since they wrote the book and how their thinking has progressed. And we don't have to take the first 15 minutes setting up like, okay, what was chapter 1 about? And what are these key ideas? We can kind of jump ahead. And it does work for our audience because, they're all marketing tech people. Like, we don't have to spend time talking about the chasm or talking about, product market fit, what that is, or like, our listeners get all that stuff. And so we can start with the kind of more exciting, interesting stuff at the end. And I think that's what, a lot of the guests say they love that. And a lot of the interview subjects love coming back because we can, kind of touch on what they're working on and talk about where they've been and where they're going. And yeah, it makes a little better story.
Yeah, I'm sure answering so tell me about the 5 Ps. What's it about? Tell me about the book. How do you implement it? Like, I know for me, and I don't even do that many podcasts, but if you want me on your podcast, you can reach out, trustinsights.ai/contact. Happy to be a guest. There's a lot of sameness in those questions, and you can tell the interviewee fatigue when they're like, I've answered this question 10 times, but okay, let me recite the script. And it does come across as very cardboard. And so the thing that I really do like and respect about Marketing Over Coffee is that you don't have that. You're not following the same playbook that every other podcast is. Like, starting like, okay, like, you have to do the basics, like, tell me about the book, tell me who you are. But then you, to your point, immediately move beyond that. You go to the last page, you go to what's next. You acknowledge the thing that everybody knows about this person, but then you really dig deeper. And then the other thing I really like is that you do ask, like, what are you watching? Like, what are the TV shows? Because I think that no matter how big the name, the celebrity, like what it is, they're still humans. They still watch, Cutthroat Kitchen or The Great British Bake Off or what, like, they still have those human tendencies. And so I really love that angle of it as well, is that you bring it back to like, okay, and now you're human. What do you do in your free time?
Yeah, that that's a lot of fun. Well, and you've run with that with Punch Out, doing that
Yeah.
cast as far as like digging, because yeah, isn't it, it's amazing. As marketers, we kind of think we're all the same because we're working on the same stuff. But
Mhm.
then you find out some of the hobbies that people have. You're like, wow, that's amazing. In fact, I'm sorry, I've been dying here. This is like both allergies and back to school are killing me. But I was talking to a guy who does podcast interview bookings, and because we had been talking about that yesterday, as far as
Mhm.
vendors that do that, and the guy who runs the company is like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'm actually doing a trek through Spain. I'm on mile 400 of 450, but my assistant will help you out." And I was like, "Wow, that's. I thought you just hung out in Michigan and fished. Like this is pretty crazy."
Well, and so as John mentioned, Punch Out. So that is actually a separate podcast that I host, and we're getting close to releasing a new season. So the podcast is Punch Out with Katie and Carrie. I co-host the podcast with the fabulous Carrie Gorgone, and we basically talk about everything except work. So that was one of the things that, so it was sort of a passion project for Carrie, is she hosted and still hosts a lot of podcasts for, throughout her career, depending on the company. She's a really good showrunner, but she always runs out of time, during the course of the podcast. And somebody will drop this like really interesting nugget about their life, like that, like, I'm on mile 400 of 450 of my trek through Peru or whatever it is. And she's like, but I want to explore that. I want to think about that more. I want to hear more about it. And when you're doing a show like a Marketing Over Coffee, that's not the point of the show. People aren't showing up to hear that, but it is interesting. So she conceptualized and created Punch Out, which she and I co-host, and we bring on people like a John Wall and say, like, what do you do in your free time? And we really try, it's interesting. People are like, well, I'm not that interesting. I don't have any hobbies. And that's just not true. Everybody's interesting. So John, I remember your episode, and we talked about the famous chicken in the toilet story.
That's God. I'm trying to think if that's been beaten. Yeah. So we had a tenant in an apartment who, yeah, tried to flush a chicken carcass down a toilet. That was a complete disaster on a number of fronts. Um, oh yeah, no, oh yeah, I'll have to come back at some point because yeah,
Uh-huh.
I've learned the 4 levels of hoarding now. There are actually 4 levels of hoarding, and we had a full on level 3 hoarding. And one a person in an apartment, and yeah, that was a 3-week quest. So yeah, if you ever wanted to do extreme home makeover cleanup, we can talk more about that. And yeah, it is. It's just amazing how it's not just the 9 to 5. People have these lives outside, and it's amazing. If you just scratch a little bit what they're getting into or where they're going, you can find all kinds of amazing stories.
Well, and what I have found in my, limited experience compared to yours in terms of being an interviewer is giving people the space to be human actually creates a better interview experience overall, because it makes them a little bit more comfortable. You can sort of talk a little bit more freely, but you can still get to, the big points. And so I remember, I don't remember exactly which guest it was, but one of our guests who was like a big name in the marketing industry and has like all of this clout and wrote a book and everybody knows them. They have this like, and in the show notes, I didn't know what it was going in, but it just said precious moments. And I was like, huh, I wonder what that's going to be. They have this really big, weird, creepy collection of the precious moments
Those
figurines.
figurines, yeah, yeah.
If you don't know what they are, please Google it. Like, and it was so off brand for what people knew about this woman professionally, but she was like happy to talk about it because it was a big part of her life outside of work. And once we got her to open up and give her the space to sort of speak to that in a non-judgmental way, she was like a great interview because she was like, I love talking about this because you sort of tap into that passion side of things that people are really excited about. And so, one pro tip that I would give people who are doing these business podcasts is make time pre-show to ask some of those human questions to really sort of get people comfortable, warmed up, talking about themselves. Something, ask them, to John's point, like ask them, what are they watching? What are they listening to? But really don't ask just for the sake of asking. Ask because you're genuinely curious. So find your version of that question.
Yeah, warm up is great. Anything you can do to get them talking. And yeah, I always joke that it doesn't matter. You can take any hobby and make it sound like the people who do it are absolutely, completely off their rocker. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. If you like golf, you're like, so wait a minute, you use, a stick to knock a ball in a hole 500 yards away and you spend half your weekend doing that. Is this true? And the same, collecting weird small porcelain figures. Like, you don't find that creepy? That's not, but yeah, you can't judge anyone's hobby because they're all ridiculous.
Well, and so we've gone a little long, but I feel like this is, John, whenever you and I sit down and do a live stream about podcasting, we never run out of things to talk about. So we might have to come back and sort of keep exploring this. But any final thoughts for people who, want to know more about behind the scenes? I can give a plug for marketingovercoffee.com. It's an 18-year-old podcast, which means that, and I say this with love and respect because it means that you've been able to stick through all of the trends, the highs and lows, and people still keep coming back because you're producing such really high quality content.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've just, we've loved it over the years. It's like we are doing all this stuff and we love all this stuff. We're geeks when it comes to hardware and everything. And so to have people that talk about this stuff that appreciate it, yeah, it spares me all those embarrassing discussions at Thanksgiving because my family could not give a damn about any of this stuff.
Any final thoughts?
Go out there, make something, start some trouble. If you have any questions about audio stuff, definitely follow us. Go hit us up in the Analytics for Marketers Slack group. We're over there. If for some reason you don't use Slack, you can always find me on all the other social channels. Just look for Marketing Over Coffee. You'll find us. But yeah, always love to talk about this kind of stuff and happy to help if you have any questions.
All right. Well, thanks, John. I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.